Hello, hello. Dave Ford here with the SoulBuffalo Earth Report, episode 14, with the legendary artist, activist, very good friend, the creative director of the Ocean Plastic Leadership Network is Ben Von Wong. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. Yourself?
I am good. I am good. It has been an interesting a week here in the United States of America and with elections and such. But Friday afternoon, it looks like there's going to be a lot of energy that's coming into the economy. I'm sorry, into the environment with what's been going on. So that's exciting. But good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you too.
So wanted to kind of jump right in. Maybe can you share a little bit about your art and your philosophy so we can just so everybody gets a sense of who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't I just start with like a really quick presentation? It'll take a couple minutes just to give a quick start to who I am visually, because I find it really hard to describe myself as an artist without being able to show the work. But long story short, I create photographs like these photos that look like they're photoshopped, or at least this is what I was doing pre-COVID. And
I think you got to show. Let me see. I have to let your.
Oh, you can't see yet.
Not yet. And hold on. And action. Now we can.
Amazing. Cool. So pre-COVID, this is the kind of work that I was doing. I was creating photos that people think are photoshopped, and they're essentially art installations that are in some form a data visualization of all the waste that we consume over time. And I like to create a sense of curiosity in the work that I do. The primary goal is to start a conversation with people, because when people look at this and they wonder, like, what am I looking at? Is it real? Is it fake? It gives me the chance to have a conversation with them. And so that's when we can go and say, oh, look, like what you're looking at is actually an art installation. It's not just a special effects green screen thing. It was made out of wood, and LED lights are in the back of this wave, which is what is actually making it glow. And we built this inside of a mall with the help of hundreds of volunteers, because I don't know actually how to build anything. So I go to local communities and I figure out like how we can empower them to work together to co-create something unique that hasn't been done in order to highlight specific issues. And then most importantly, we get a chance to talk about why we did this. And so you get to talk about how 168,000 plastic straws were collected over the course of 9 months with the help of communities all across Vietnam. And it was to show how small little individual actions add up. And we take the time to market this whole thing and package it so that at the end of the day, this thing is like a Guinness World Record, right? And so then it gets the international visibility. And so it elevates the conversation from the local into the global, and it becomes this holistic thing that all plays together. And so I believe that.
Do you get like a trophy from Guinness? How does that work?
I got a little piece of paper that I had to pay for that says that I'm a Guinness World Record holder.
You had to pay for it?
Yeah, you have to pay for it, man. Guinness is it's a business model, so they charge. So if you want a Guinness official to come, you have to pay thousands of dollars to like have a real person come in. Otherwise, you just pay like a certain fee, and you have to show a bunch of a proof that you've done the counting and how you did it, what your methodology was, who were your witnesses, so on and so forth.
How long did it take you guys to count 168,000 straws?
It basically took one day, because we would weigh them. So we kind of bunched all these different straws up, and then we weighed an average, and then after that we just kind of packed bag after bag directly in front of a camera in order to prove that this was the amount that we thought was inside of the piles.
Wow. And where did the straws just gathered from all over Vietnam? Was it like what was the method, your sort of method to get them all?
So I collaborate with local nonprofits. So in this case, it was a group called Zero Waste Saigon. They were the first they were the first nonprofit that was formed by a group of expats. Julia Mesner was leading that, and they would, they were leading the sustainability movement, and so they just mobilized their grassroots movement all across the country to contribute, and it's just really awesome to see.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and so yeah, the reason I do these kinds of things, I mean, I think the way we look at sustainability generally kind of comes through a lens like this. It's just news articles that aren't particularly compelling, and so only the people who already care about the issue will want to dive deeper into it. But for the most part, how do you draw the rest of the world in? And so I think art has sort of this role to play of like inviting people into the conversation. So we take the microfiber pollution problem as an example. The clothing that we wear, polyester, nylon, spandex, these are all things that get released back into the ocean every time we wash our laundry, and no one thinks about it twice. So how do you visualize that? How do you bring an emotional connection to it? And so there's this, part of the equation, which is really like, I want to create a sense of shock and awe. I want people to look at this and go like, well, what am I looking at? And then you kind of draw them back in and say, oh yeah, this was just created with the help of a bunch of university students in Georgetown University. And this whole thing was made out of cardboard and clothing that we collected from Goodwill, because we're really trying to highlight locally, once again, this story of these students that were trying to they were trying to design a bag similar to the Guppy Friend to collect these microfibers. And just showcasing, once again, the youth rising up. And so this David versus Goliath sort of thing is, I think, really interesting to always keep in mind. So there's like the narrative of what you actually built, but then there's narrative of how you got there that I think is often forgotten. And this is where the relatability comes in, that I try to do. And so, the final piece of the puzzle is kind of this idea of data visualization, right? So we look at, there's so much data in the world these days, and so we have these beautiful infographics that people are putting out there, but ultimately, human beings make decisions emotionally, not through facts, which is kind of problematic, because we have so many facts that are telling us what we need to be doing, and then the emotional piece is sort of missing. And so what I try to do is I try to take a statistic like, oh, every 60 seconds a truckload of plastic flows into the ocean, and I try to bring that to life. And so I did this project with Greenpeace where I went down to an island called Corfu, which doesn't have any drinking water. So within a week, we were able to collect so many plastic bottles, just by putting it out on the local radio stations, and these schools, these students all came together, and we just unpacked these bottles, tied them together, tossed them into the back of a truck, and then threw them back out just to see like, oh, well, what does it actually look like to have a truckload of plastic flow into the ocean, and to show how impossible it would be to just rely on individual consumers to resolve this problem on their own, that it's really a problem that is far greater than we can actually do. So I guess this is kind of a little snapshot into the work that I do, or try to do,
in order
to create these conversations.
It's so hard to make this data mean something to people, right? When 4.3 million metric tons, right? Like, and like the idea of real sizing it, like so that people can actually understand. And like, for example, we did this Scientific American article a few months ago, and we're trying to like figure out how to describe the amount of masks that are getting into the ocean. And it's like, essentially the amount of masks that's going into the ocean right now are equivalent to, you could cover the entire country of Switzerland. It's like 17,000 square miles of just masks, not including gloves. And it's insane. What you're doing is actually like taking it to the next level of the real sizing with that last example. And I think it's super interesting too with the microfibers, because, there is an emotional tug that happens when people see polluted beaches, but it's all single-use plastic. It's not, nobody's complaining about microfibers floating down the river because you can't see them. So like, how do you make that real so that people understand? Because a lot of the clothing companies really are getting a free pass specifically related to plastic pollution right now,
Yeah, well, I mean, sooner, like it's one of the battles for every movement start off in different phases. There's always like, in the beginning, you're just trying to raise awareness, and at some point you go from awareness to kind of policy and change, and like the actual change always lags behind the awareness. And so there's this period where people are just frustrated, and I think I've in the work that I've done, I've really tried to play more on the awareness space, specifically when it relates to like what are the issues right now that more public pressure could help accelerate the rate of change. And so I think it's something that we all saw pre-COVID anyways, that the environmental movement and the plastic crisis had reached sort of this tipping point, and it was all on the cusp of change, and suddenly things have kind of slowed down a little bit these days as a result of COVID. But I'm sure it's going to be coming back up, because ultimately plastic in the oceans and single-use plastics doesn't benefit anyone in the long run. And so everyone is interested in trying to find out what a solution might look like. But in order to keep people interested and to keep people engaged, I think that's where art kind of comes in, right? Because if you're just repeating facts over and over and talking about policy, and you're not invigorating people at the end of the day, they're going to lose steam and they're going to fall off.
It's interesting. It's Ben and I, you and I have been diving in on this idea of like the intersection of art and policy. And it was funny, we were working on a program with a lot of the big brands, a lot of sort of the big stakeholders in the US, really across the spectrum, from waste management to government, to talk about passing a bill here to help, essentially at its root will help the recycling infrastructure, but that will also, help with preventing plastic from getting into the environment. And it's the complexity of just this one bill in this one country is just so enormous. I mean, it's like 19 points with 10 sub points underneath, and like all these different stakeholders trying to figure out, where they sit with respect to this legislation and modeling other countries. And it's like, where can art come in and just make it simple for everybody to understand? And these are the conversations Ben and I have.
Yeah. So when we were talking about this idea of this, like, multiple stakeholders and how do you bring them all together? Well, like, let's say you do this survey or you interviewed like all these like 50 different stakeholders with 19 different questions and 10 different subpoints. What you're going to end up with is this massive, impossibly complex document of text. And within that text, you don't get to necessarily see or understand that we have more in common than we have differences, right? Like, everyone is ultimately at the table because they're looking to build a solution, which means that fundamentally everyone is against the status quo. And I think we often forget that, I think in the world we live in, which is sort of driven by sensationalism and outrage, and we have these different systems of thinking where we default to one way of thinking, that ultimately, if we can slow down a little bit, there is quite a little bit of consensus. And so my hope in working together with you and to help co-create this data set and find ways to interpret it and inject it with some emotion, we can actually start pulling out a sense of possibility, right? Because if you're reminding people through the data that they have submitted and allowing them to feel a sense of possibility and a sense of consensus and a shared understanding, it starts to feel more possible. And that's a kind of motivation, I think, and the spirit that we need to get people from different sides of the table to sit down and continue that conversation. And so you've done a really great job of convening people. How do we ensure that these people stay engaged and continuously feel inspired to continuously work on this problem? Because it's going to be a long battle, right? So that's my hope with our collaboration together.
Yeah, and it's just so complicated. Let me see if I can share.
Nice. You're going to share your map.
Like some meta thing going on. You see my screen now, Ben?
Yeah, I see it.
So I use this slide all the time, and it's like my chaos slide. When I'm talking to people, I'm usually like, this slide is going to stress you out. That is the intention. But this is just one issue, and it doesn't even really scratch the surface. But you have 193 nation states recognized by the UN, and then definitely a few more countries that aren't, where I'm sure there's really, really crazy plastic pollution problems. But there's usually a combination of like protecting and polluting or not doing enough, depending on where it is in the world. Obviously, like each country has its own set of challenges. Some are funding solutions. Like this is just, again, ocean plastics. The financial sector that funds some solutions in some cases is funding and giving positive economic incentive for performance for everybody in the plastic value chain. So like, and to kind of humanize this, you have your oil and gas companies, you have your petrochemical sector of folks that are making plastic resin, your packaging converters that are making your strawberry containers and everything that you find at the grocery store, your consumer packaged goods companies that are packaging their stuff in these packages, retailers that are selling, waste management folks, and a whole slew of waste management solutions. And then you're hoping this is in a circular economy. But then you have your activist NGOs. So picture your, folks in the Break Free from Plastic movement that want to cut plastic off, largely from the tap, right? And then your industry engaging NGOs or folks that are trying to support the industry. The industry here is moving significantly. You have advocacy and trade groups that are putting pressure all over the place. Your consumers that are only recycling 10%, as an average, and 15 million informal economy workers that are like the last line of defense that are marginalized in the developing world. And it's just a crazy, chaotic mess, right? And 193 different sets of laws. So it's been interesting because, Ben, we've seen in the last couple of weeks a call for a global treaty for plastics to try to help bring some uniformity to this issue and across the globe. But these things take like 10 years to happen. I mean, talk about like policy at its highest form. Like where you and I have been exploring this idea of like, can art accelerate something at such a scale? And that I get super fascinated talking about this.
Well, I mean, ultimately, I don't have the answer, and I don't think any of us necessarily will have the answer, but I think it's something worth trying to build into. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the people that are, the ones that are going to be working on policy are people, they're human beings. And so they need to stay motivated. They need to stay inspired. They need to stay hopeful. They need to feel a sense of progress and a shared mission. And so like, these are all like what we have in common is our shared humanity. And so hopefully through the vehicle of art, in order to build consensus through data, I think that we can strike the balance between not just the groundwork that needs to be done, but the emotional strength and resilience that comes with that.
Who are some of your biggest inspirations?
I don't know. I tend not to follow. I tend not to follow individuals. I think individuals are just. I mean, everyone's fallible, and so it's more about just being able to draw on different lessons from different people who are doing interesting things whenever convenient. So I actually like to take a very broad and diverse approach to the world. Like I don't. I personally consider myself as someone who lives on the intersection of worlds, and I love just floating between different universes. And trying to figure out like what lessons can you bring in from the outside and how can you add diversity of perspective into a situation. So this idea of being a divergent thinker is something that I really enjoy.
Well, if you had to pick a few other divergent thinkers to hang out with for a weekend, who is there anybody like that you've been right now into that would help your creative expansion or something?
That's a great question. I don't know who would I name like specifically. I recently had a wonderful conversation with a guy called Max Stossel, who's a spoken word poet, but he also works.
I've met him before. He's an amazing dude.
I haven't met him yet, but I randomly emailed him the other day because I wanted him on my podcast. And
that's John Stossel's son, right?
Yeah.
He's a really, really cool guy. I met him like a year ago. There you go.
Yeah. So Max is super interesting. He works as an educator also for the Center for Humane Technology. And so he's one of these guys, one of these other artists who also sits on the intersection of art and policy. And so I was just really curious to understand, well, like what is his involvement like with the Center for Humane Tech, and how does he measure his own impact? How does he know when he's doing enough? And so I had all these like very like metaphorical questions to ask him. And it was just a really cool conversation. He had created a piece on an episode of a podcast which talked about how, and I think this was true when he created the piece about 2 years ago, but he was talking about how do you know that something matters if it isn't made out of any matter? Like what does it mean to make something matter when all that matters are the words that you create? And I don't know, it's so beautifully said that it really resonated with me. He was talking about how, you throw a rock inside of a lake and then it disappears, and those ripples that you create, like, are those ripples enough? And, at some point the rock's going to sink and the lake's going to be calm again. And so did that matter? Did that make a difference? And it's just it's so interesting. And so I don't know, I get really excited to see how other people think and process things, and specifically who kind of live on this intersectionality. And so this podcast for me has been sort of quintessential to connecting with people who I can have an excuse to have a conversation with. Another guy that I'm having a conversation with this Sunday, his name is Eric Burlow, and he's like
Impact Everywhere, we should say, is the name of your podcast.
My podcast is called Impact Everywhere. It explores positive impact in unexpected places. But like, as I've started getting deeper into data visualizations, I wanted to understand and talk to different people who are using data intersecting with like art and science and what that looked like. And so I had, in San Francisco a couple years back, I had met this guy called Eric Burlow, and he spends months out in the mountains, like tracking down frogs. But then, he's also a TED fellow, and he's created multiple visualizations of like, he can map out a robust ecosystem simply by mapping out which species are eating which species. And that map of who eats whom determines how robust and resilient an ecosystem actually is. And so I'm just curious to understand, like, what has his journey been like in mapping policy, like mapping complex systems like that, and where has it landed him? And so I just have conversations like these that I think are really interesting because they allow you to see the world in different ways through different lenses.
We ran 2 really big expeditions like 4 years ago in southern India for a big energy company. They had like 30 executives out there, and it was all around human wildlife conflict in southern rural India, where tigers and humans were basically like at war. And so elephants and humans at war. Like elephants like raiding crops and stomping on people, and people super pissed off at elephants. And people get outraged, but like it's like that's their like biggest source of conflict. And then tigers will take people's livestock and they'll put the basically poison the dead cow, because the tigers will come back a couple days later, and then tigers die. And if tigers die, and this happens all over the world, if tigers die, then everything dies. It's like the
because they're an apex predator, right?
The alpha predator. Yeah, I mean, like in the Middle East, I was reading something the other day. In the Middle East, there were lions forever and ever and ever. And then all of a sudden, all the lions were killed out, and everything deforested. Soon after, because the goats started eating all the grass. It's just like when they reintroduced the wolves into Yellowstone, and the whole ecosystem came back because the deer population was checked.
Mm-hmm.
Who would be so this was just like one, like from like he was talking, this guy goes and looks for frogs, but he's kind of looking at it more like a sort of smaller animal type level.
I don't know. Well, I just want to talk to him more about like how he intersects data and biology, and what he's found to be helpful. Like, what are the tools that he uses, and how does he look at a problem, and what unexpected conclusions he's landed upon depending on what he's done. And I don't know, there's just so many. So another guy that I talked to that maybe is relevant to this was the founder of the World Toilet Organization, which is a real thing. And so he created the World Toilet Organization. His name's Jack Sim. And he created this, I think, 13 years ago. It's more than 13 years ago, I think in 2003 or something. It was to like play a pun on the World Trade Organization, right? So he was doing it from a marketing perspective. And it was because 2 billion people in the world don't have access to clean toilets. And so he thought it would be interesting to start making people aware of this, because that's where so many diseases and so much suffering comes from when you don't have access to a toilet. And except that it was always being lumped under like a water problem within the United Nations. And so he wanted to separate water and sanitation as two separate issues. And so after I don't know how many years, he managed to successfully get this passed at the United Nations. Like World Toilet Day is an official thing. Every year they host the World Toilet Summit, and they have people talking about toilets all the time. And now, like in India and in China, like it's a political issue to like have toilets, and he's the one leading the charge on this whole thing, which is really fascinating. And he'll talk about how within a movement, you're simultaneously the most important person because your voice matters, but you're also the least important person in the movement, because when you die, you have to trust that the movement is going to continue with or without you, right? And so it's like how do you create a revolution but not be the hero? How do you just simply be the person that's like guiding others to be their best selves? And how do you use leverage as a model in order to unlock everyone else's potential? And so he says it doesn't matter how big of an organization you are. At the end of the day, your resources are finite. However, if you empower people to do what they want to do, then your resources are infinite, because now everyone is working for their own gain, for their own egos, for their own success. And now you've suddenly got access to an infinite amount of resources. You just need to point them in the right direction. You need to give them the right story. So like I'll just have conversations with different people that will just kind of spark all these different ideas that I think really add to your capacity to solve problems in unexpected ways.
That is super cool. And so you've done like 33 of these so far.
Yeah, I've done 33 of these podcasts so far. This week's that's coming out is an architect who he creates like palaces and mansions, and he's a sustainable architect. And he one of his latest properties, he bought a forest, and that was going to be purchased by a titanium mine, and decided to build a luxury resort without cutting a single tree down. So to get access to this resort, you have to take a zip line down. And he hired all these people from the local villages that were poaching in the national forests and converted them to hunters, just like to convert them into rangers, the same way that these sort of African models have worked in the past to protect them. And so they're collecting snares, they're collecting illegal chainsaws, and it's all being funded by this super expensive, it's like the most expensive hotel in Cambodia. And that's one of his projects. Another project is creating a human zoo, where there was a rich group, a conglomerate that reached out to him to design like a brand new zoo. And he's like, I don't like zoos. What about we create a human zoo instead? And so they're taking zoo animals that are not carnivores, rehabilitating them and giving them free space to play and putting the water holes right next to where like the human hotel rooms, the human zoos are. So it's basically one big safari. And so now this entire land area is now being designed for preservation. And his hope is that because China is the major market for wildlife purchasing, that he can now use that as an educational opportunity to get people to fall in love with the wildlife, to say that, you know, wildlife is not something you eat, it's something that you come and you appreciate and you protect. And it's specifically targeting those that are wealthy, because most people can't access these kinds of places unless they have a lot of money. So it's just shifting the narrative through luxury architecture. And so there's just so many different hopeful, unexpected ways that change can happen. And I find it really interesting to like look to other, like, we can look at all the negative headlines, or we can look at all the positive headlines, and there's some really cool people out there doing really great things.
Yeah, really across the spectrum, right? And I mean, I think it's interesting when you get in these environmental issues, there's such strong opposing viewpoints that usually, you know, put the planet, you know, directly in conflict with a capitalist system that we're in. But there's people doing amazing things all over the place. Lots of big companies doing amazing things, lots of, and investing in incredible solutions. I mean, it's like some of the stuff that comes across our desk was fascinating. I mean, with respect to ocean plastic, like seashell, you know, basically replacing plastic with seashell. And it's like nowhere close to scaling, but just like starting to see like all these different opportunities that will be unlocked one day, right? And it's just, I guess the thing that like keeps me up at night is just like, how do we just make all this go faster? And I keep coming back to the consumer, right? Like it's like consumer awareness and consumer understanding. And that's where you come in, and that's where art comes in. And that's where it's like, how can we make a shopper in Walmart care about the type of plastic that they're, you know, how much plastic, even thinking about the amount of plastic that they're using. And awareness in these last few years has gone through the roof, but it needs to be like 20x, like in a hurry, especially with the ocean.
Well, I think there are three ingredients for like a movement to happen. I think you need a system. Oh, you need a slogan, you need a symbol, and you need a system. And so if we take like Donald Trump has that like really well done with "Make America Great Again," which is a really great slogan. It means a lot of things to a lot of different people, but by and large, it's not one that you can totally disagree with. He's got his like red hat. He's got his brand as an individual, and then he had a system that he put into place, which is basically break the existing system. And so it's simple and it's easy to understand, and everyone can sort of get behind it. And so he's able to galvanize a whole group of people who may not necessarily have very deep understanding of what it actually means to quote unquote make America great again. And I think we can sort of hijack components of that and do the same thing. What I think the plastic movement has sort of failed to do is to actually propose an alternative system. While you may have, like, I think on the NGO side, there's like a call for a moratorium on plastics, but then if you put yourself on the corporate, like Nestle side, who, I don't know, makes 30,000 plastic bottles a minute at each plant that they own, like it's not an option. And so what is the alternative system? And so what I think is really interesting about the work that you're doing, and why I've been really interested in working together, is that you are looking to bring these multi-stakeholder parties together to actually get that system piece in place. Because once you have that system, then all you need to figure out how to do is market it. And we know there's a consumer demand for it, because nobody wants plastic in the ocean. Everyone wants to make more sustainable decisions, but you need to propose a system, a timeline, how we're going to get there. And it needs to be something that like can be really clearly understood. In the climate movement, we sort of have that right now with this idea of like fixing things by 2050. I think as you dive deeper, there are always going to be struggles and the granular thing, but at least you can mobilize people to understand what exactly are we working towards, and what is it going to look like to get there. So, yeah, I'm excited to see like, you know, where like what happens when you start bringing all these different people together and propose something.
Yeah, well, and I think it's also like, at what point can we get to a snowball effect of on the solve? Because right now we're like nowhere close. I mean, 5 years ago, nobody was even talking about ocean plastic. Very few compared to like who they're, you know, how many people are talking about it today. But it's just like, you know, how can we get, you know, things moving at warps? They get a lot of 2025 goals, a lot of 2030 goals. Like now there's a new report that came out, Breaking the Plastic Wave, that says that 2040 is the earliest we could possibly get the ocean cleaned up 80%, or, you know, get the amount of plastic down 80%. And It's just a long time, and that's a lot more plastic in the ocean. So it's like it's to get people to care when they have a lot of the people, a lot of the countries where at least it's coming in to the system are really people that are on the ground there are having a hard time in in these parts of the developing world, but they're so important to the entire the equation. Some would argue the most important.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is also just staying hopeful and trusting that ultimately, we always overestimate what we can do in 1 year and underestimate what can be done in 3, let alone 10. Decade upon decade, if 10 years ago you were to predict what the world would look like today, you probably wouldn't be able to do it. And so similarly, what will the world look like in 10 or 20 years from now is a really, really tough question. The number of innovations we've seen pop up to address these issues, and the kind of snowball effect that does happen. We look at, I don't know, the girls from Bali, like teenage girls from Bali who can get Melati and her sister who were able to like get plastic bags banned at the through like government as a result of just launching a grassroots campaign called Bye Bye Plastic Bags. And that creates an example for other youth advocates and youth activists to kind of stand up and do their thing. And I've been following a little bit of what's going on in Bali. I think Melati's boyfriend has a nonprofit called MakeAChange.world, and they're in the process of putting their own like super cheap versions of just metal grids that are manned by people who come by every week to scoop out the plastics themselves. And so these systems sort of like I think as people start playing with the idea and realizing how possible it is, novel and interesting solutions come out. So you'll always have the grassroots side, but then on the science side, you'll also see some other weird stuff happen. I think recently, I don't know if you saw this, it was some scientists are proposing to put microplastics in the ocean to remove microplastics.
I think I missed that one.
I was reading this and I was like, wait, what? So basically it's these essentially like microfibers that attract microplastics to it, and then when it attracts enough pieces together, then it just floats to the surface. So now you can remove it, because right now microplastics are impossible to remove. So that was just like another weird thing that had just cropped up, and so ultimately we do have to believe that like the so long as the magnitude of the problem stays in focus, which I think it does. It wanes. Currently, like we're probably on a little blip of attention span because we're focused on other things. But this problem isn't going away. And so the demand for change will only increase over time, and the rate of change will only accelerate as all these systems slowly start kicking into place. So on my end as an artist and a storyteller, it's about figuring out, well, how do we ensure that as we raise awareness, we don't just raise rates of frustration, right? Because if you just raise awareness and you don't provide a solution, you're just making people more frustrated. What you need to do is figure out how to connect those two pieces together and to continuously empower people to make them feel like there is a sense of progress, like unending progress towards a single goal.
I think that's an amazing place to stop today, man.
Sounds good, man. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. We have next week, Tuesday, we have Yoni Sharan of Systemic, who was the author of the Breaking the Plastic Wave report that I talked about. So super excited for Yoni. And then on Thursday, we have Nick Mallows from the Ocean Conservancy, who is just an author of another really big paper that came out that really went deep on how much plastic the U.S. produces. And that was a big piece that came out last week. So anyway, Ben, thanks, man, so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the line.
All right,
Good luck. Keep up the great work.
Sooner than later. All right, thanks, buddy.